Good evening and welcome to the National Conservation Training Center. I'm Mark Madison. I'm one of the organizers of the Public Lecture Series. And coincidentally, we've been doing this for 250 years. So it's kind of a double celebration next week. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, just a couple announcements. I'd like to let folks know that the Friends of NCTC is a co-sponsor of this lecture series. I'm going to introduce Andrew Moore. Andrew actually reached out for help with an image, and not only did we fail to find that image in our archive, but then we forced him to come here and give a public lecture. So we've exploited him a lot. So I think the very least we can do is all buy a book when this is over to make up for our rudeness. His book is called The Beasts of the East, which initially I thought was about the New York Knicks, but actually is the fall and rise of America's eastern wilderness. It's a fascinating book, great topic. He's going to give you a sense of the much richer fauna that at one time lived in this part of West Virginia and the entire eastern seaboard. He also has a very interesting background. He is the author of Pawpaw, In Search of America's Forgotten Fruit. The pawpaw, of course, is a fruit that's not forgotten much in this part of the country. It's pretty ubiquitous. It was a James Byrd Foundation Book Award finalist. We've never had anybody speak here before that was recognized by the James Byrd Foundation. That's kind of cool. He has been featured on the PBS NewsHour, The Atlantic, the New York Times, Saveur, the Washington Post, and more. And he's appeared in all these newspapers, and yet he told me this is the most prestigious place he's ever been. So he lives in Pittsburgh. He very kindly came here on his book tour. The book is very recent. It's a relatively new publication. Please give a very warm West Virginia welcome to Andrew Moore.
Thanks for that introduction. Thanks to the facility for having me. Thanks to the Friends group for co-presenting this. And thanks all of you for coming here on this beautiful evening. You could be outside, but you're inside here with me. So thank you so much. I didn't say that this is the most prestigious place that I have talked, but I will say it now. This is really a treat to be here. Walking around the facility with all these icons of American conservation, their artifacts and their pictures, and it's really humbling to be in a place like this and to think about all the people who have come before, and all the folks who are here today who are carrying on that tradition of conservation. It's a real privilege to be here. It's also great to come to this part of the country. So, as mentioned, my first book was all about the pawpaw, and this part of the world, they grow like weeds. They are just everywhere. As a lover of pawpaws, when you come into a place like this, you're excited. It's really fun to be here, and to see them at the entrance of the building so prominently planted there. For me, especially, it feels like a spiritual homecoming to come to a place like this and to just be in the land of the pawpaw. It's really a wonderful experience. So I thought, since the book is fresh and new, I might start with a short reading from the book. And in a sense, I'm going to begin with the end. I want to read a passage that details the killing of the last eastern elk, and it's a page and a half, so it won't be too long, and then I'll begin talking. It's difficult to say with certainty when the last eastern elk was killed, but most accounts agree that Jim Jacobs pulled the trigger. Known as the Seneca bear hunter, Jacobs had killed hundreds of deer and bear in his lifetime. A Seneca Indian, Jacobs was born on the corn planter tract in Warren County, Pennsylvania, around 1795. Over the years, his hunting exploits had grown into legend, and with a body covered in scars from battling bears, he'd become a local folk hero, not unlike Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett. His hunting territory ranged for hundreds of miles, from the Allegheny River in southwest New York to the West Branch of the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, all of which he covered entirely on foot. He was tall and strong, and even into his 80s, he was described as erect as a pine and as strong and active as a buck. Killing bears made Jacobs his name, but killing elk made good supper. Elk were once an abundant source of food in the Alleghenies, both for the Seneca and for the settlers streaming in. One year, as work crews poured into the forest to build a new rail line, Jacobs fed the men elk steaks and kept the surveyors, axemen, and chain carriers supplied with plenty of it all summer long. Pennsylvania and much of the rest of the East had been elk country for thousands of years. But by the 1860s, the elk were scarce. In fact, Pennsylvanians began to wonder if they were not extinct in the state, as they hadn't been seen for more than 20 years. Then, in September 1867, while setting traps in the wilds of the Cinemahoning Valley, a hunter heard the unmistakable bugle of an elk. In earlier times, autumn bugling would attract a harem of suitors, when more than a dozen cows would congregate to feed and mate. An elk's bugle is a singular sound, beginning with the high notes of a brass horn and finishing with a low roar. The call fills the landscape and seems to come from all directions at once. The author David Peterson wrote that if you've never heard an elk's bugle, you'd think it was some tortured soul from hell, howling in anguish and pain. Today, an elk's bugle is most often associated with the high Rocky Mountains, but that haunting sound also belongs to the valleys and hilltops of the eastern United States. News of the bugle spread quickly and sent local hunters into a frenzy, scouring the forest for one last chance for glory. Perhaps a few of these hunters were content with the chase alone, a chance to relive the thrill of hunting days gone by when large game was common. The youngest among them may have never even seen a living elk. A few may have been desperate for meat and hide. Whatever their motivations, these hunting parties would not succeed, and the elk would elude its would-be killers for a little while longer. But Jim Jacobs was on its trail, and Jim Jacobs was a slayer of big game. And Jim Jacobs was successful. He did take down that last elk, which is where we find ourselves today. All of the elk that were east of the Mississippi were killed. Every single one that ever existed here. All of the bison, and just about all of the wolves that were east of the Mississippi were killed. And my book, what I set out to write was a story of restoration, was a hopeful story of putting things back together. That's what I was attracted to, a story that could be positive, could show that humans could maybe undo some of the damage of the past. And this project, writing about these species, these three species, the elk, the bison, and the red wolf, got started 10 years ago when I learned that the state of West Virginia was going to reintroduce wild, free-roaming elk to the coal fields of southern West Virginia. Logan County, in fact, is where they were going to put these elk. And I was fascinated because the word was reintroduced, which implies that they had been here before. And I, like so many other Easterners, had no concept that elk were in the state of West Virginia, a forested state, a state that looks nothing like Colorado, for example. And I had a hard time visualizing elk in this part of the world. I'll tell you, even a biologist I speak to, the Pennsylvania elk biologist, one of them has admitted, I asked him point blank, when did you know elk were in the East historically? And he said, when I applied for the job to be an elk biologist. And a number of many other folks in the East, folks who work with these animals, have told me that. So I went down to Logan County in the summer of 2016 to get a look at the habitat where they were going to be letting these animals loose. There would be no fences. These would be wild, free-roaming animals, nearly 1,000-pound animals, big free-roaming animals. And I got to look at the landscape, and it was reclaimed mountaintop removal coal mine sites in Logan County. That's where these animals were going to go. And then I went back in December when the animals were let loose and saw the crowds gathered there and saw the excitement from the local community. So after I first heard about the elk in West Virginia, I also learned that bison were going to be placed on a tall grass prairie preserve a pair of tall grass prairie preserves in Illinois and Indiana. And I had kind of known in the back of my head that yes, bison were east of the Mississippi long ago, but I still thought it was fascinating and couldn't quite figure out how they were going to pull this off in the farmlands near Chicago, how they were going to exactly reintroduce these animals. And I would later learn that the limits that were placed on these animals, these bison, unlike the elk, would not be free roaming. And so I thought something was happening here, and what I found out was that something had been going on for a very long time. The reintroduction of these large animals was the maturation of a movement, and not one movement, of course, but several. And in the case of the first two species that I profile, it's the North American model of wildlife conservation in the one hand, and ecocentric ecological restoration in the other. These large mammal reintroductions I had begun to investigate led to many other questions about the future of our landscapes in the East. And one of the important questions we're coming up against is whether our eastern landscapes are to be entirely domesticated, which in many ways is the trajectory we've been on for the past several hundred years, or whether there's a chance for the resumption of wild nature and wild evolutionary processes. And if there is a chance for the latter, for the wild things that we live with, what responsibility do we have as the great domesticators of this planet? What responsibility do we have to preserve, and in the case of the eastern U.S., to restore that wildness? And this is not a new idea. Ecologists and conservationists have debated this point for decades. But it was in that same year, 2016, that E.O. Wilson's book, Half Earth, was published, making the case for setting aside half of the Earth, which is a whole lot of Earth, for conservation. When you consider the proposal that the other half of the Earth is going to be urban or domesticated or agricultural, perhaps half Earth is not only necessary, it might not be enough to capture and preserve the biological diversity that we have inherited. E.O. Wilson's idea of half Earth struck a chord. And in 2020, 4 years after that publication, we entered the UN Decade of Restoration. And some communities and some governments have called for 30 for 30, for example, setting aside 30% of the land in conservation. The state of Vermont, for example, has a call to set aside 30% of that state for the purpose of conserving the state's biological diversity. Some of you might know that in Pennsylvania, where I live in Pittsburgh, we have an elk herd. After Jim Jacobs killed that last elk, a few decades went by, and sportsmen were wistful for those old days of the big elk, even the big deer, because they had just about killed all the deer. So in 1913, they put some elk on rail cars in Yellowstone and put them on them old-time railroads and sent them all the way back to Pennsylvania. And then these sportsmen let those animals loose, just like in this picture. This was pre-wildlife management disciplines in colleges. This was pre-doing habitat feasibility studies. They simply let the animals loose. And they did okay, but they soon found farm fields in northern Pennsylvania, and farmers soon shot many, if not nearly all, of these elk. A couple years later, they tried it again and put even more elk on the landscape. And the state of Michigan did the same thing. And that's actually where this is, in the Pigeon River country of northern Michigan. This is not what we would call today ecological restoration. stalking game animals like this. We didn't have those words yet, ecological restoration or ecocentric restoration. But this work was an antecedent to what we have today. And it was part of the movement that would later become restoration ecology. And furthermore, it was an attempt to bring back the wild animals and the wildness of the East that had been squandered just a couple decades earlier. And it was an attempt to restore what had been lost. And this was the beginning of that movement. And of course, it was also an opportunity to give those sportsmen an opportunity to hunt big game. And that's very important to the story. Again, the elk would not immediately thrive in those areas, and for decades they became a backwoods curiosity. People would talk about maybe seeing those elk in northern Pennsylvania or the Pigeon River country of Michigan. And in fact, it wouldn't be until the late 1990s, when mountaintop removal coal mining was at its height in the Appalachian Mountains, that eastern elk would again become a tantalizing prospect. So for decades, for most of the 20th century, elk were forgotten in the eastern U.S. Back in the early 20th century, at the same time as these sportsmen were restoring these first herds of elk, the nation's first ecologists, so naturalists who would identify as ecologists, were in the eastern wilds documenting forest communities and spending significant time in the last old-growth forests. And foremost among these ecologists was Emma Lucy Brown of Cincinnati, Ohio. And there she is, deep in those woods of East Kentucky. And it just so happened that where Brown would do some of her most important botanical work is where the movement to restore the elk to East Kentucky would be revived in the 1990s. In the coal fields, the productive coal fields of East Kentucky. Brown visited Perry County, Kentucky, on several occasions in the 1930s. And she was originally lured there by the reputation of the big poplar of Perry County. She would note that the trees in this area, these poplars, were the biggest trees she'd seen anywhere outside of the redwoods of California. This tulip poplar had a 20-foot circumference, and she became enthralled by the diversity and ecological significance of East Kentucky. And over the course of her career, she had covered 65,000 miles on expeditions to document species and associations and communities, plotting out succession and climax trajectory. She documented species new to Kentucky and built an herbarium collection of nearly 12,000 species. She went as far as the roads and rails would take her and then went further on horseback. If a mountain slope was too rugged for the animals, she would go on foot. And it was here in eastern Kentucky, in the Cumberland Plateau and mountains, that she lingered, and she called this area the Mother Forest. This kind of primeval forest had vanished elsewhere in the East. Around the same time Jim Jacobs was killing those last elk, we were also cutting down the last big trees. Brown coined the term the Appalachian mixed mesophytic to describe the ecoregion, the moist, broad-leaved, deciduous forests characterized by diversity, canopies of shared dominance, and a rich herbaceous understory. And as we would later come to know, the assemblage of salamanders, snails, and insects here was among the most diverse in the world. And during the last glacial period, East Kentucky was a refugia for species pushed south by the advancing ice sheets. And because of variations in topography, slope, and soils, because of its north-south axis, species were able to migrate as the climate had warmed or cooled. And in that irregular topography, species found niches to survive and to speciate, to evolve and grow and repopulate as the continent warmed again. Quoting Braun here, she wrote, "The deciduous forest of the Cumberland Mountains is outstanding in its superlative quality, in number of tree species, in size of individuals, in variety of forest types. It ranks as one of the finest deciduous forest areas of North America." The Mixed Mesophytic Forest Association is here at its best. Nowhere else, not even in the Great Smoky Mountains, is it as well developed. Coming here to East Kentucky was revelatory for Brown. She wrote, "Botanizing in Eastern Kentucky is particularly interesting because of the element of surprise, which is introduced from time to time by the finding of totally unexpected plants. Because of geographical location, Kentucky is a meeting place of northern and southern Allegheny species. We expect hence to find white pine and magnolias, but we do not expect the extreme northern forms, which extend south in the higher mountains. Neither do we expect to find in the plateaus and mountains any considerable number of plants from the coastal plain, nor, because of separation from the Blue Ridge province, typical southern Appalachian species in any quantity. Yet all of these groups of species do occur," Brown wrote. And this one tract of forest, the Lynn Fork of Leatherwood Creek, rose above the rest. Oftentimes we see tracts of so-called virgin forest from which this or that tree has been removed, or if the canopy is intact, with the undergrowth ruined by grazing or by rooting hogs. But not so here, she wrote. Nothing has ever disturbed this area. The luxuriance of the undergrowth is beyond description. But then we destroyed nearly every acre of these forests that she was describing. She attempted to save the Lynn Fork, but there were new economic interests in these poplars for making blocks for the hat-making trade. And after the rails were laid to get into these last forests, they cut down all of the big trees. Except for a few isolated coves and hollers, we cut all of the timber in East Kentucky, as we had in Pennsylvania and New England and all throughout the East. And as we would later as we had previously with the tall grass prairies with the plow. And then we did more damage to East Kentucky. We went after the coal eventually with an intensity that far outpaced the lumber operations. And eventually we moved entire mountains. In 1979, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act had mandated reclamation on these mines and had inadvertently opened the door for something called mountaintop removal coal mining. The tops of mountains were blown apart by explosives and pushed into the valleys below. And when all of the coal was extracted, the former mountaintops were compacted to prevent landslides, and they were seeded with fast-growing exotic grasses and shrubs like autumn olive that would survive in the compacted rock. Taking a look at these landscapes in the late 1990s, just 30-some years ago, a Perry County resident and commissioner of the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, Doug Hensley, had the wild idea of stocking elk on these reclaimed surface mines. The lush, mixed mesophytic Appalachian forests were gone, in some cases at tens of thousands of acres in a given area. So why not put them to good use, he thought. Why not bring those western animals back east? We've created the grasslands. Why not put the big beasts that occur on those grasslands on these areas? The elk of central Appalachia, the elk that would come and to be released in East Kentucky, and they would move over 1,500 elk from the west to East Kentucky over the course of just 5 years, the largest movement of large mammals probably anywhere. They are entirely free roaming. And in this way, they are a return of a kind of wildness to these lands. But they are not, as they are sometimes portrayed, a symbol of ecological restoration. Their mere presence doesn't assure that ecological restoration has happened here. These animals largely occur on novel grasslands dominated by exotic species. And these places for intact interior forest communities the elk may increasingly become a burden, not unlike the way deer and over-browsing by white-tailed deer have become a burden to many eastern habitats. But as we will see, these elk possess something that the bison on Midwestern prairies do not. They are wild, they are not behind a fence, and they are able to make choices and go into these habitats and do things that are unpredictable, that are not prescripted and controlled. And so there is value in that work nonetheless. As this map shows, elk reintroduction has spread to locations throughout the East over the past 25 years, and you can see the elk reintroduction zone of central Appalachia now encompasses Tennessee, West Virginia, and Virginia. And as these elk zones expand, it will be up to us to decide which of these things to value, whether ecocentric restoration is the most important thing with these landscapes, or whether abundant game species in the modern East. Which brings us to the bison of the Illinois cornfields. Indeed, some of the most thorough and inspiring and detail-oriented, some might even say obsessive work of ecological restoration is happening in the Corn Belt east of the Mississippi and has been going on for decades. And it is now happening in tandem with the reintroduction of bison east of the Mississippi. From their lowest population in the late 1800s, we pulled bison back from the brink. The American Bison Society, which was formed in 1905, rallied public support and attention for the species at the time of its greatest need. In 1907, the American Bison Society sent animals from the Bronx Zoo to the newly created Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge, the first of several reintroductions that would bring the animals out of captivity and back into refuges and parks throughout their former range. The society would go on to successfully lobby for the creation of the National Bison Range, and with a national fundraising campaign, paid for a herd to populate that new refuge on the Flathead Indian Reservation in western Montana. At Yellowstone National Park, where the country's only free-roaming herd of wild bison still remained, they were protected in the form of the Lacey Act, which regulated the sale of wild animals and finally gave teeth to fledgling anti-poaching efforts. For how dire the situation had been for this species, as you can see the amount of skulls piled here just outside of Detroit. These are bison skulls that were picked up off the plains and brought east for industrial purposes. It was in fact dire. The subsequent turnaround was actually quite quick. As early as 1916, the American Bison Society had declared that not only is the American bison no longer in danger of extinction, but it is firmly established in all parts of the country. Around this time, Yellowstone National Park actually found itself in the strange position of having too many bison and began culling a couple hundred animals from the herd on a regular basis. Americans were proud of this recovery. We had pulled the buffalo back from the brink of extinction after shoving it there a generation earlier. Those who wanted to see them, these animals, Americans who wanted to see bison, could drive out into the countryside and see them in national parks and wildlife refuges in the western states. Private bison ranchers were soon cropping up throughout the nation. Ted Turner bought his first bison in 1976, and in a few years he would come to own the largest bison herd in the world. And private ranchers, in fact, would soon come to hold the vast majority of the world's bison. These animals were within reach as specimens to view and to eat, and the threat of extinction was no longer looming. Bison were abundant in our parks and our imaginations, and they became icons of conservation, symbols of a wild and free America. In their destruction, we had seen America at its worst, and in their return, we had seen ourselves at our best. And as long as people could see that the animals existed, they were assured that so too did a wild America. But to save the American bison, we'd enter them into a Faustian bargain. We would restore a fraction of their former abundance, but almost nowhere would they be allowed to roam free. Just about every herd of bison in this country would be confined behind a fence. And even in those places, when they moved beyond determined boundaries, they were hazed or killed. We did this hazing and killing and confining at first to secure the population from harm, to keep them from poachers, to keep them from dissipating across the landscape. And we kept doing it to protect cattle and the range of private ranchers. And we kept on doing it decades later because we could not imagine sharing the land with bison in any other way. Fencing bison, and really only bison, had become the American way. The bison have become our national animal. But we treat them in a way that is very unique in the sense that animals as fierce as grizzly bears and 10-foot alligators are allowed to roam this continent. Not everywhere, but in places. And it is the bison that we contain in such a unique way. With the exception of 2 projects in Utah, state fish and wildlife departments have not sought to restore bison for sport hunting. And aside from a few exceptions, bison are largely showpieces or a slightly wilder species of livestock. But in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, a third way of existing with bison was developing. Bison, this time as ecosystem engineers, as disturbance regimes, as a force like fire and flood. In the eastern United States, this idea, bison as a force on the landscape, as an engineer of biodiversity, would be realized for the first time at Nechusa Grasslands, a tallgrass prairie preserve owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy in northern Illinois. The motivations of bringing bison to Nechusa Grasslands were not to save the bison, unlike so many other earlier projects. They were not bringing bison to provide a game species for license-buying constituents, nor were they trying to provide an educational experience for the community. This was not an interpretive bison herd. They wanted to use the bison because of the way bison interacted with the Illinois plant communities. Or I should say that they wanted to use the bison for the way they believed or imagined bison might interact with the plant communities of this tallgrass prairie. Because bison hadn't occurred on a prairie in the east for over 150 years. They were gone before the advent of ecological study. So the project of putting bison on these tallgrass prairies east of the Mississippi was a fact-finding mission as much as anything else. It was an experiment. This idea was born in the mid-1980s when Chicago area conservationist Stephen Packard realized that the conservation efforts in Illinois were falling short of conserving the totality of the state's biological heritage. In Illinois, natural areas were largely given over to agriculture, unlike in Pennsylvania or even West Virginia, where the forests had been cut and then were allowed to regrow. Much of Illinois was tallgrass prairie. Up to 60% of the state was grassland, and that grassland was plowed up and was never allowed to return to some kind of ecological natural state as our forests in the eastern part of the East have. These natural communities were gone and never coming back because they were such rich agricultural soils. By the 1970s, they had identified that 1/10 of 1%, so less than 99% of the tallgrass prairie in Illinois remained. From 22 million acres of grassland, they were down to just over 2,000 acres, highly fragmented, high-quality prairie. And all of these grasslands were found in like small postage stamp preserves throughout the states. They were saved largely because they were too inconvenient to plow. At this time, the conservationists of the state, primarily botanists and plant ecologists, had succeeded in preserving some of those natural areas that remained. But few of the high-quality prairies were larger than 5 acres, and most prairie bird species would not nest in a site that was smaller than 25 acres. So they were too small to serve the needs of the animals that had evolved in those grasslands. And so the future of these scattered sites as a land community that could support the evolutionary potential of the state's indigenous species was bleak. So what could be done about that? Well, Stephen Packard and his colleagues were at the cutting edge of ecological restoration in that part of the world. And what they wanted to do was to find a high-quality site, a remnant tallgrass prairie, surrounded by degraded land, even if it was cornfields, even if it was cattle pasture. And they wanted to restore those degraded lands. At a time when no one was doing this, no one was planting prairie from scratch. So we can kind of take for granted decades later that, yes, we can restore grasslands, but at the time, no one did this. And for an organization like the Nature Conservancy to spend their hard-earned conservation dollars that folks had been donating to them on cornfields because they said, we think we can restore the tallgrass prairie, was a big gamble. They wanted to do this not just for the plant communities, but as I mentioned, the animal communities, the prairie bird species that require open areas to nest in. They wanted to do this for the resumption of evolutionary processes, and they wanted to put someplace, at least one site east of the Mississippi, where they could put all of the pieces of the eastern prairie back together. Ron Panzer, one of the leading entomologists of that area at that time, said that plants account for only 10 to 15% of the organisms in an ecosystem. You can't restore the prairie if you ignore at least 50 to 60% of the organisms of the original prairie. So whereas game agencies for nearly a century had been stocking game species like geese and deer and turkey, they started stocking these prairies with insects, rare, remnant-reliant insects, and they were stocking them in this prairie to complete the picture. But Steve Packard was also interested in things far bigger than a regal fritillary. He was talking about establishing an Illinois tallgrass prairie that was big enough to support animals like elk and bison. And there was this site at the edge of Lee and Ogle counties in Illinois that had remnant hill prairies. This is where they're standing right here. It was too rocky to plow. The John Deere plow, which had been invented right over the river from this site, did a great job of tearing into the black soil prairies, but it couldn't do much with these rocky sites, and so they were left alone. And for well over a century, the indigenous prairie community persisted on these islands of rocky outcroppings surrounded by cornfields. This land, though, was almost subdivided into housing sites. Some rare plants existed here. And they had been there for centuries, and they were almost bulldozed for a subdivision. And yet Steve Packard convinced the local Nature Conservancy chapter that they should purchase not only these high-quality remnants, but also the surrounding cornfields and recreate the tallgrass prairie around it, and hope that they could turn the cornfields into a high-quality prairie. They were doing this because there were no prairies east of the Mississippi with hognose snakes and smooth green snakes and regal fritillaries and upland sandpipers and sparrows, Henslow sparrows and grasshopper sparrows, and bison. As Aldo Leopold had written that if the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. If the biota in the course of eons had built something we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And so that's what they were attempting to do here in the late 80s, was to put together all of the parts. Before they could introduce bison, though, they had to restore, according to their own principles, they had to restore the entire system. And they had a lot of work cut out for themselves. They started with a couple hundred acres of degraded gravel hill prairie and a few acres of fine grade A prairie and a whole lot of cornfields. They removed invasive species. They gathered seed from remnants in local counties, and they planted prairie into the black soil of the cornfields. Now, this was not the only ecological restoration project at that time, nor was it the first of this kind, but it would grow to become one of the finest in the world. This site, which started with just a couple hundred acres of degraded prairie, is now 4,000 acres, and it's home to 245 species of birds, more than 700 plant species. Recently, the prairie white fringed orchid was introduced to this site, and at recent count, there were 400 blooming stems of this rare and endangered plant. And Nechusa grasslands, the site that was in some parts created from scratch, is now home to the largest population of this rare orchid. But decades would go by before bison would come to this site. That was the vision. That was what they were talking about. That's how they got people excited about this project, was talking about the big animals. But they wanted to redo the entire ecosystem first. You can see how it contrasts with the elk of Central Appalachia. So eventually the consensus came that the prairie east of the Mississippi, as elsewhere, needs bison just as it needs fire and sunlight. Nechusa's managers believed it needed grazing to control the tall grasses that define the habitat. And there were specific target species that they believed would benefit from grazing. So, for example, prairie bush clover, this rare clover, was identified at that site in the 70s. There had been cows on this site grazing, and when they were removed, this species, this bush clover, started to vanish. And it turned out that the cattle grazing on the prairie may have helped keep it open for these species, like the bush clover, to keep the dominant grasses that would grow, this high in check, to create conditions that would allow the species like the bush clover to thrive. There were bird species that hadn't been seen in years. And again, they were hypothesizing that the tall grasses were too tall for birds that needed different structure. Some birds like the tall grasses, some like the short. So in 2014, they finally reintroduced bison to the site. And it was the first time that bison were on a high-quality tallgrass prairie east of the Mississippi in over 150 years. This area is just west of the major migration route of sandhill cranes. Some spend the summer there, some stop over only on their way south. In 2017, 3 years after the bison had been reintroduced, endangered whooping cranes came to Nechusa grasslands. This was the first time that whooping cranes and bison had been seen together on an Illinois prairie anywhere east of the Mississippi since perhaps the 1830s. For all we know, whooping cranes had a relationship with bison and bison landscapes. When the last whooping cranes were discovered at their breeding grounds in Canada in the 1950s, it was in the boggy wetlands of Canada's Wood Buffalo National Park. Hundreds of years ago, before the prairies were plowed and the wetlands drained, when a more robust population of whooping cranes would have migrated south, they would have flown south through the bison-grazed prairies of Saskatchewan and south toward the tallgrass prairies and salt marshes of the Gulf Coast. Most of their range, the whooping cranes would have been associated with bison. And there are still significant mysteries about bison east of the Mississippi. We know they were east, but what kind of ecological communities did the bison thrive in? Was it just the tallgrass prairies? What was the abundance of the bison? Where exactly on the landscape did they occur and thrive? Were they in the early successional bottomland communities along our great rivers, where we now have cities and highways and agriculture? Were they in the eastern savannas of the Piedmont? Or, as at least one archaeologist has begun to suggest and insist, Were bison east of the Mississippi River actually spending significant times in forests? Were they more of a browser in the east than we'd previously assumed? 40 years ago, Steve Packard said about bison on eastern prairies, "No Illinois prairie has felt the tread of buffalo for over 100 years. Yet many of the rare plants at Nechusa are thought to depend on the disturbance of the wandering buffalo herds." I say thought to depend because no one really knows. The eastern tallgrass prairie was gone as a functioning ecosystem before the science of ecology was born. No one has ever studied it. How much the long-term survival of some species depend on others, no one can say for sure. But we know enough to be confident that it makes a lot of sense for conservationists to try to rebuild at least one eastern tallgrass prairie as complete and intact as possible. And that's what they've attempted to do at Nechusa grasslands. And the same idea applies to us in Pennsylvania, where I live, here in West Virginia, and throughout the Alleghenies in Appalachia. We should try to create ecosystems, recreate and restore ecosystems that are as complete as possible. And back to mysteries. For example, between 1940 and 1985, we thought that the plant running buffalo clover was extinct. But it was rediscovered in 1985 in West Virginia. Bison are thought to have played a role in maintaining open habitat and seed dispersal of this species, hence the name running buffalo clover. But we don't know because bison and running buffalo clover no longer occur together. Free-roaming bison in Yellowstone, for example, tell us nothing about the interaction between wild bison, large wild grazers, and plants like running buffalo clover, and the ecosystems to which they belong here in the East. And recall again Aldo Leopold's first precaution of intelligent tinkering, to keep all the parts. We have found running buffalo clover in a lot of new places since 1985, and we have removed it from the endangered species list. But its abundance on the landscape, like the buffalo itself, is still a far cry from its former extent. And while we do know more about its disturbance dependence, we do not understand, to borrow Leopold's phrase, the full relationship between buffalo and, in fact, many thousands of years of grazing and disturbance of extinct megafauna and plants like running buffalo clover, because we don't have these assemblages anymore. Just last month, 4 weeks ago, there was a naturalist in southwest Pennsylvania who discovered the largest, healthiest patch of running buffalo clover in the state. It's a really exciting find, and it happens to occur just minutes away from Buffalo Creek in Washington County, Pennsylvania. So we've got forest preserves, we've got designated natural heritage areas, but we've still got missing pieces of the assemblage. And we've also got major limitations. Fenced bison are not magical creatures, and like a cow, if their stalking rate is too high, or if they don't have enough acreage, they can overgraze a pasture or a tallgrass prairie. I visited a state park in Kentucky that had a herd of bison, and the manager of this park said that he tried to plant native grasses, and the bison loved them too much, and they grazed them to nubbins, and those species no longer occur in that pasture in Kentucky. So it is not as simple as just putting them together, especially if these animals are fenced. So I like the stories of the bison and the elk as contrasting and as demonstrating the compromise of living with these large animals east of the Mississippi. We have wild elk in abundance now in central Appalachia, but they occur and they depend on these lands that are degraded, ecologically degraded lands. And that is the reason we have an abundance of elk in East Kentucky, not necessarily because we have been good stewards of the earth in that part of the world. And we have high-quality tallgrass prairies in Illinois and Indiana, where the diversity is as high as anywhere east of the Mississippi, but we do not have free-roaming bison there. because we have not yet figured out how to do that in the East and really anywhere in the United States. Okay, finally, I want to talk to you and briefly about wolves. Wolves in many ways embody this wild and wilderness idea in North America. And there's any number of ways to discuss wolves. And what I want to do is focus on the ecosystems of the East. But first, I would like to acknowledge that we killed every single wolf out of New England, out of the mid-Atlantic, and out of the southern states east of the Mississippi. But just west of the Mississippi, we hadn't got all of them. There were a few red wolves in the coastal prairies, marshes, and ranch lands of southeast Texas and southwest Louisiana, even into the 1960s. So this is really late in our wolf wars to have wolves so close to the eastern United States. By the 1980s, we'd gathered those last stragglers out of the marshlands of the Gulf Coast. And we decided it was necessary to breed them in captivity so that we might restore them elsewhere in the wild. Their numbers were so low that they had begun to interbreed with coyotes, and we feared that we would lose this species. And eventually, we looked all the way to the east, to the Atlantic, to the Albemarle Peninsula of northeast North Carolina. This is an area of Pocosin swamps. Pocosin is an Algonquin word that's thought to mean swamp on a hill. This area had formerly been dominated by Atlantic white cedar, but we cut all of those cedars down. And while there's still some nice stands of Atlantic white cedars on that peninsula, there's also lots of pond pines and cypress trees and an incredible wilderness of thick, brushy Pocosin wetlands. When deer were nearly extirpated from the coastal plain of North Carolina, they found refuge in this area of North Carolina. The same with black bears. When they were gone from much of the state, they found refuge in these swamps. And today, this part of North Carolina has some of the highest densities of black bears anywhere in the East, and they have some really, really big, impressive bears. But we almost lost this landscape as well. There was a dramatic battle in the 1980s where this last wilderness, and we had begun to realize that that's exactly what this was. This was a last wilderness on the East Coast. There was a scheme to mine all of the peat out of these wetlands for an alternative fuel source. But eventually, this land was saved from further development, and it was donated to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it became the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. And discovering this landscape and going there, writing this book, was one of the joys of writing this book, was to learn about this wilderness that we have in the East. And really, lacking any other place to put these red wolves that we had taken out of the wild, we put them here, as far into the Atlantic as you can get in the East, on the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. For a while, the wolves of this peninsula did pretty well. It has been an intensive project which has involved sterilization of coyotes when those animals eventually showed up in every square inch of the eastern United States. It has involved pup fostering of wolves in wild dens. And it has gone on for many, many decades. But these Pocosin wetlands, this wildlife refuge, although it is big and although it is sprawling, it has proved to be a bit marginal habitat for the wolves. Or to be a bit more accurate about it, the agricultural lands that are just outside the refuge have proven to be a very productive habitat for prey species that the wolves want to hunt and need to hunt. So the agricultural fields just outside of the wildlife area have proven to be where the wolves want to be because that's where the food is. But this led to conflict, not because the wolves were eating livestock, but eventually the conflict was the wolves were taking deer that some local hunters thought belonged to them exclusively, the sense of ownership, and because local landowners wanted to shoot coyotes for sport hunting, and because a red wolf looks an awful lot like a coyote, it led to a lot of trouble. And so a movement of local people decided they didn't want those wolves on their private property, and they killed just about all of them again for a second time in our history. About 6 years ago, there were only after a high of about 150 wild red wolves in around 2011, the population crashed to about a dozen wild wolves on the landscape. Thankfully, there are wolves in zoos and captive breeding programs, so we have at least 200 of these animals in captive facilities. But of course, that's not the same as having them on the landscape as a member of the ecological community. The fact that local landowners did not want these wolves on their property effectively shut down the recovery program, which had been successful for nearly 40 years. And the Fish and Wildlife Service and the environmental nonprofits that advocated for the wolves were tied up in litigation, and it really kept any action from happening. So I talked about how intensive the program was when there was sterilization of coyotes who were paired with wolves, or pup fostering. Those things did not continue while there were lawsuits pending in courts. The good news again is that the program is back up and running. Pups are once again being born in the wild, and the federal government is actually spending money to build highway wildlife crossings for these wolves in this part of Northeast North Carolina. This will be a significant project because after gunshot, road mortality, car mortality was the second leading cause of death for these animals. And they're not getting started on the project right away, but it is in the pipeline, and so that is good news for these wolves. But the fate of the red wolf, it is good that we are building this infrastructure, and it is good that the Fish and Wildlife Service is once again able to intervene on the behalf of these animals. But the fate of these animals is, as it has been, in the hands of local people, and will always likely be in their hands, whether or not they want to live with these animals. Folks like you and I, who must make a decision to welcome wildlife, really truly wild animals, onto your properties, especially in the East, where there's so many of us humans living and building houses all the time. Most of the landowners in the Albemarle Peninsula that have resisted having wolves on their property, and not all of them do, many of them have entered into contracts with the Fish and Wildlife Service that say that they will welcome wolves on the property. So it's not a monolith by any means. There are people who support these species. But the ones who have opposed, they own more land than maybe some of us living in cities in the East. But the idea is similar, that the idea of accepting wild nature and accepting our modern responsibility to steward this life. So first we have to accept our role in the destruction and disruption of ecosystems. We have to accept responsibility for that. And then we have to accept the role of the steward. Again, the red wolves of the Albemarle Peninsula aren't disrupting livelihoods. They're not taking livestock. There's not really livestock on that peninsula. Their biggest crime, in the view of the folks who are anti-wolf in that region, is that they eat deer. Of course, it only takes a handful of bullets to disrupt red wolf ecology. You can have plenty of willing landowners, but if you have one or enough of them who are shooting the wolves, it's a disaster for recovery. But those problems can be overcome. And I think the emotion of these landowners is something that we can relate to. Perhaps not the same emotion, but the presence of a large animal on our property produces within us a feeling. I think often of my neighbors in Pittsburgh who have planted these lovely gardens, and they have white-tailed deer come in and eat all of their flowers and vegetables. And I like to remind them, and I like to remind myself, think about how hard you've worked to nurture that landscape, and you've spent money on it, and think of what you want to do to that deer in that moment it is eating your hard work. And then remember how the landowners on the Albemarle Peninsula feel when wolves take something that they think belongs to them. I think it's important to understand each other and to understand and to, from a place of understanding, try to find solutions. Now, I said earlier I was attracted to these stories, that I wanted to write about reintroducing these big animals because I wanted to tell a hopeful story, an inspirational story of ecological restoration. And I think in the restoration of native plant communities and in the restoration of some of these large animals, there is a lot to be inspired by and to be hopeful about. But the story of the red wolf, which is the ending of the book, is not really a happy ending. But I do think it's the ending we need at this moment in time. It's a reminder of all of the work that remains. And also it's a reminder of how high the stakes are. Species can go extinct if we are not working on their behalf in this world that we have created. The persistence of a number of species depend on us making good, thoughtful, caring choices. So again, I've said it before, it's easy to villainize some of the private landowners of the Albemarle Peninsula who shoot red wolves with impunity. And I'm not here to excuse those folks who break the law and who value life so little. But I do think we must realize that there is not a future for the red wolf if it continues to exist on this biological island at the edge of the continent. If we're only asking a few landowners on the edge of North Carolina that coexisting with wolves will be your burden and your burden alone. Again, we are supposed to, according to the Endangered Species Act, put these animals in more than one location. We cannot have recovery if they're just in one place, and if that one place they happen to maybe not be welcome. Because wolves, and red wolves in particular, occurred just about everywhere in the East. They occurred in my backyard in southwest Pennsylvania. They occurred here in the panhandle of West Virginia. And if we are going to save biological diversity, life in the East, this work begins in our own backyards. And if we are to conserve the full suite of biological heritage that we came into the world with, and the wildness of these places and the self-willed essence of those species, like the elk in Central Appalachia, like the wolves in North Carolina, then I think it also requires us treating our public lands and our private lands as a shared heritage. And we must steward these spaces and species together as a community. So thank you for allowing me to share the stories of these species that I have been devoting myself to for the past decade, more or less. And I hope maybe you have some questions, and maybe I can go back to some of these pictures that I went through very quickly. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that any of you might have. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Megan Bean. I'm the National Librarian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're here at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, with Andrew Moore, author of the recently released Beasts of the East, The Fall and Rise of America's Eastern Wilderness, as well as Paw Paw, In Search of America's Forgotten Fruit. Andrew is from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he's joining us here as a part of his book tour, and we're so excited to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here at this beautiful campus.
Awesome. Yeah, we're so happy to have you. I'm sorry we don't have pause while you are here, but I had actually seen your last book, and I have a copy. And I was wondering how you got interested in the East and Appalachia as a topic for your books.
Yeah, well, so I grew up in Florida, where we have tropical fruits growing in our backyards. And in 2009, I moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. and a friend invited me out to this thing called the Ohio Pawpaw Festival, and didn't really know what a pawpaw was, but I was game. I was like, okay, let me go check out this festival of this rare fruit, or this unknown fruit to me. So I went out there, and after having survived or spent my first winter in Pennsylvania, and the trees lose their leaves, and I'm, as a Floridian, I'm like, well, are the trees all dead? Are they, are they going to come back to life? Is this spring a real thing? So anyway, so that's sort of the background. So I'm at this festival, and we go into the woods around this festival, and there's this broad-leaved, tropical-looking plant with this custardy fruit hanging from it, and it's just littering the ground, and it's falling everywhere, and you pick it up, you break it open, and there's this custardy flesh on the inside. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that this cold place, this northern Ohio place, had these tropical-like fruits growing on it. And so I was captivated, and I needed to know everything about this fruit. I needed to know why this wasn't common. Why wasn't it in our grocery stores? Why weren't all of my neighbors growing it if they could? And so it really just out of just needing to know about this thing, being curious. And so I set out to learn everything I could about the fruit. And before long, I realized, as a writer, well, there is a great topic here that hasn't been explored to the extent that I was craving. So not finding a resource that was this compendium of all pawpaw knowledge, that's kind of what I set out to do, was to just put it down on paper.
Oh, that's incredible. And, like a spark of inspiration from the biodiversity of this area, which is really cool, especially because you're from Florida.
That's
that must
right.
have felt so new to you. So I'm from here in West Virginia, and when I was starting to read your book, I had no idea that there were buffalo in this region. And I think that was going to be really surprising to a lot of people who read your book. Yeah. So what do you think other people might be most surprised when they read Beast of the East?
When you dig into our local ecologies and our histories, you find so much that will surprise you. And that is really the connection between pawpaw and Beast of the East, is this not looking far away places for wild nature or inspiring biodiversity, looking in our own backyards. And I did that with pawpaw. That was this Eastern American fruit. And with Beast of the East, it's a similar curiosity of, we know about the buffalo in Yellowstone. We know about the great elk herds of the West, and we know the wolves of the Rocky Mountains. But realizing the Eastern U.S., this place we call home, was every bit as wild and filled with great quantities of large animals, and that this place, its heritage, its natural state, is just as inspiring as any of those places that still have those animals, and that the work of restoring that wildness in those large animals is really inspiring. And again, we don't have to look to far away places to find that. It's happening in our own backyards as well.
Yeah. So do you find yourself kind of looking around at our modern landscapes in the East and imagining what these familiar places might have looked like 300 years ago?
Yeah, of course. When you open the Pandora's box of ecological thinking, you can't help but to think about it all the time, right? And right here on the campus here in Shepherdstown, there's these great grasslands and meadows, and they're filled with milkweed and red cedars popping up in them, and all these great wildflowers. And you can't help but picture, or I can't help but picture, elk coming over the hill, or bison coming over the hill. And we know that they were east of the Mississippi. We have the descriptions. In some cases, we have bones of these animals. We have indigenous people told the European settlers, that where they encountered these animals. And we know that the habitats have changed a great deal in the East, of course. There would have been a lot more open meadows than I think a lot of us think. We've heard the fable of the squirrel that could go from all the way down the East Coast without jumping off a tree. But the reality is these habitats were much more diverse, and there would have been openings and grassy openings for the grazers like the bison and the elk. And when you see places where these eastern meadows have been restored, like here where we are, it helps you to remember that. and allows you to imagine that. Because without those habitats in the modern period, you can't even picture those animals being here. So in some cases, the places I write about in the book, the restorationists start with the landscape first. They've recreated the tallgrass prairie, for example, east of the Mississippi in Illinois and Indiana. And only after painstakingly restoring the ecosystem are they able to then reintroduce the large animals.
I'm so glad that you're talking about this particular focus of restoration and conservation. I'm not sure if anybody told you, but the large meadows here at NCTC, this is former agricultural land. So our land managers are actually doing something similar, kind of restoring habitat that maybe wasn't exactly like that 300 years ago, but still introducing and bringing in native species as it is today. So these concepts might be new to some of your readers, and I was wondering if you could describe what rewilding is to somebody who's maybe never heard of it before.
Yeah, rewilding is a word it's really being used a lot more now, right? It's been used in a lot of different kinds of places too. You know, rewilding your landscape, rewilding your live is a way people have used it. And basically, simply put, it's putting big animals back on the landscape to restore a feeling of wilderness and to restore ecological processes that were disrupted by removing large animals. It's also really a fun way. The word rewild, it's an evocative word. It's really, in its best practice, ecological restoration, which is something that maybe people who are in the discipline of conservation will know that term. And so if rewilding is a bit new for someone, restoration is something that people can latch onto. And although that phrase rewilding is new, we've been doing this work for a very long time in North America. The elk that live in Pennsylvania, for example, and the elk that live in Michigan, they are not the indigenous herds of those places. All of the elk east of the Mississippi were killed before the 1800s were over. But we have elk in Pennsylvania and Michigan because in 1913 and 1918, sportsmen in these places said, we need elk back. We miss having these large animals that my father used to hunt. And so they put these animals back on the landscape in those places. So this impulse is really not like a new 21st century impulse. It's something that Americans have been doing for a long time, whether it's restoring populations of wild turkey or white-tailed deer in the east, or even these examples of the elk. This is something we've been doing for a long time, and it's something that I think Americans feel, deep in their bones, this need to restore and to bring back these large animals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a lot of the books I've read and a lot of the information, I've just consumed in my role is Americans have a really close identity with the wilderness, with the wildlife of America. It's just part of who we are. But do you think that all species that were formerly present in the East, whether they're extinct, whether their range has changed, are candidates for reintroduction? Because there's some real implications sometimes.
Sure. Candidates, sure, right? Like, should we think about it? Yeah, we should think about restoring all of the animals. I think that is our duty as responsible stewards of the land, is to, at the very least, consider putting everything back that used to be here, that still exists. In some cases, we don't have that opportunity. Some animals have gone extinct. The Carolina parakeet, the ivory-billed woodpecker. There are some animals we can't do this work with. But if it still exists, if it's still out there, I do think that is our responsibility to restore those populations. And as you kind of hint at, there's implications, and it's challenging. Things like cougars, or panthers, as Easterners used to call them. Wolves even. These are very contentious species, and reintroducing them is not easy. And we do have to be careful, right? We can't just throw animals out on the landscape, because it's irresponsible to those animals too if they don't have a good future there. If we're next to metropolitan areas or interstate highways, it is turning the animals loose in those areas responsible for the individual animals, for the populations, and for the human community. So we have to look at it. But yeah, I think we should be considering all of that work.
Yeah, and you really can't predict everything that could happen.
No.
I know that scientists, biologists, communities try to do a good job, but how can we weigh those decisions about restoration or conservation when those results aren't always predictable?
Yeah, of course, and you kind of don't want them to be predictable, right? With some of these large mammals, you kind of want a little bit of wildness in these animals, and you want them to do things that are unexpected. The animals that I profile in my book, the elk, the bison, and the red wolf, they were all gone before ecological study was a discipline, right? Before there were botanists and wildlife biologists studying populations of wild animals. So we never got a chance, of course, to study their interaction in natural areas, right? So we don't know how bison interact on an eastern tallgrass prairie until we put the animals there. We don't know how herds of 1,000-animal herds of elk will impact the Appalachian forest until we do it. And the same is true with wolves. So we should go into these projects expecting to not know everything and to be prepared for the animals to do things that we're not expecting. And also we should prepare the communities, right? You know, if we're doing this work, we have to have good relationship with neighbors. And, you know, if you're doing this work on a federal land or public land or state land, when those animals go off onto public or private property, we have to have a good relationship with those folks and let them know what to maybe expect, because of course those animals are not going to stay on delineated public lands in most cases. They're gonna move. That's their work. That's their job, is to move.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
In the research for your book, did you come across any unexpected allies or partners for conservation?
Yeah, absolutely. That is, much of the book is about people, right? Mm-hmm. And about the relationships that it took to pull off these reintroductions. And they, in each and every case, they were the first of their kind, you know, and folks hadn't done this work. Folks hadn't reintroduced extinct in the wild wolves back into the wild. You know, when that happened in North Carolina in the late 80s, that was the first time that had been attempted, and would ultimately be successful. The same with the elk story in East Kentucky. We had reintroduced elk in the early 20th century, but small numbers of them. And what they wanted to do in East Kentucky was move over 1,000 elk over the course of 5 years. This was a big movement, probably the largest movement of large mammals ever. So it's a big project. And in East Kentucky, for example, the partnerships were the state game agencies and large coal operators, mm-hmm. who agreed to put these animals on their private lands that were now growing in grasses because of the mining operations. And that is an unexpected partnership, right? The conservation of a large mammal species and surface mines. And throughout, that has been the case, you know. Whether in Illinois and Indiana, it's, you know, a farmer who's willing to let botanists spend as much time as they want on his property, because his property has remnant prairie species growing on it, and he allows them to document those species, and he allows them to do controlled burns in the 1970s on his property, because he deep inside he had this conservation ethic, but he was a private farmer who had to make money on that land. But he was willing to set a little bit of it aside because of its value to biological diversity. So, yeah, those partnerships, and it, you know, it's public, private, it's different people working together. That is throughout the book, and that is the story of conservation. Really, is finding common ground.
Absolutely. And what do you think your average person, individual, can do to contribute to the recovery of our beasts of the East? Yeah,
the average person can do a lot, and the stories in the book are of average people, you know, whether it's volunteer prairie stewards banding together to buy remnant habitat and then restore that habitat as volunteers, whether it's serving on commissions, right, and having a voice at an official level. That is how all of this work happens, is by broad swaths of people banding together to value this life. Home gardeners can do a lot in their backyards to plant native species, to attract wildlife, insects, birds. But these mammals, in most cases, need large lands, need landscapes to move around. So the average person has to care about large, intact landscapes. Many times that's public lands, right? We need those lands for animals like wolves, like elk. They rely on big, intact, natural areas. And so we get to keep those public lands as long as people care about them and use them and value them.
So do you think that's part of the intention behind your book, is just to inspire that caring in people who read it?
Yeah, and that was a journey for myself as well. When I set out to write the book, I wanted to tell the stories of these big, exciting, charismatic animals. And as a writer, as an author, I came away with that ethic through the process of writing this book over years. So it's not what I set out to do, but it's what it ultimately became in the end.
Did you go through any interesting rabbit holes or any unusual kind of paths in your process of research for the book?
Absolutely. And the book was twice as long, I'll tell you. When I first submitted it to my editor, it was like 300,000 words. So it's a big book, so if you can imagine, it was even bigger. So yeah, every rabbit hole I went down, I was just fascinated by, whether it was the free-ranging horses of East Kentucky, or the history of hunting cemetery prairies in Illinois and Indiana. All of these stories were captivating to me. So I did in fact have to whittle it down to keep the narrative focused on these three species, just to give it some cohesion, to pull it together. But yeah, every rabbit hole was where I found myself at the end of the day.
Oh man, sounds like you had to leave out some really fascinating concepts.
Yes, but more for the next time.
Great.
Yeah.
Speaking of, next time and other books in this genre, do you have another favorite author or a favorite book, kind of writing in a similar vein that you do about environmental history or nature?
I mean, that's all I read. I do read some other types of books and fiction, but yeah, I mean, I'm really inspired to be here in this library too, because you have all the works, that I've consulted, and some of the great works in history and, new works. They're all here, and so it's a real treat to be surrounded by these books. I live in Pittsburgh, and Rachel Carson, of course, is from the Pittsburgh area. We name things after her there. We have a Rachel Carson Bridge. We have her homestead has been preserved, and her work has been inspiring. Of course, we all know Silent Spring, but also finding some of her other writings, whether it's her letters, her personal correspondence, or some of the pamphlets she wrote for like the Fish and Wildlife Service. For example, she wrote about the Matamuskie National Wildlife Refuge in North Carolina, which is near where red wolves were released originally. And her writing about that place, she's so poetic, and she understands what's at stake with conservation, as well as anyone. And so to read her words about these places that I got to visit while reporting was a real treat. And to be here, and there's a typewriter, that she used to work on in this facility. So yeah, it's a treat to be here and to be surrounded by all this work.
Well, thank you. It sounds like you're drawing from like a really wide field of inspiration, from Carson, and I'm sure you collaborate or communicate with some of the contemporary authors as well. I hope that maybe you'll join our America's Wild Read Book Club sometime in the future. We are going to be featuring Beasts of the East in our fall book club as a sneak peek for anybody who's listening or watching this. So we'll talk about this again pretty soon.
Great.
And thank you so much for coming. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. And maybe I'll show you around the library after this.
Would love that. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Yeah.